We are looking at the beginning of protectionism for international trade, so we're going to look at some relevant issues. So first of all, we need to understand what happens when the world price is either above or below the price that would be existing in your country if there wasn't trade. So if the world price is higher than the domestic price, then the country becomes an exporter once trade is permitted. So they must have some kind of comparative advantage, most likely, in that good. If the world price is lower than the domestic price, then the country becomes an importer once trade is permitted. Comparing the world price and the domestic price before trade indicates whether the country has a comparative advantage in that particular good. If the domestic price is low, then the country may have a comparative advantage in producing that good relative to the rest of the world. If the domestic price is high, then this suggests that foreign countries have a comparative advantage in producing this good. And we can see that captured in the diagram to the right. We're also going to assume that most countries are price takers. So what we mean by that is that we're going to generally assume that most countries have a negligible effect on the world markets. If the country has a small economy, then their trade policy will not affect the world price of a good. Such a country is said to be a price taker in the world economy. So in other words, the country cannot be influencing the price. It can't be so big that happens. If the world price is above the domestic price, will the country become an exporter or an importer? So if the world price is above the domestic price, the country becomes an exporter. So just a little tester here. So as an exporter, one can view the horizontal line, so we can see this demand from the rest of the world as a horizontal line, at the world price as representing the demand for a good from the rest of the world. This demand curve is perfectly elastic because as a small economy, they can sell as much of this good as it wants at the world price. What are the consequences if the world price is above the domestic price? So if the world price is above the domestic price, we know that they're going to become an exporter. So let's look at what's happening here. The price, this is going to be the price now that is charged even domestically. Because if we have people that are willing to buy our goods, and we know that the demand curve is perfectly elastic, so we can sell as much as we want at the world price, we're not going to sell at a lower price in our domestic market, simply to be nice. We're going to charge everything at the world price. So let's look at what's happening here. Let's bring down the price here. This is the domestic demand. And here's our domestic supply. So we have Q1 and Q2. So let's just also make reference to the fact that this is the domestic quantity supplied, and this is the domestic quantity demanded. So if we're going to produce more than our domestic market wants to buy, well, because we're now engaged in trade, this can become the exports. So domestically, because this is intersecting with our domestic demand curve, this is what our local consumers want to buy. This is what we're producing at that higher price, the world price, and the difference, or the surplus, is made up in exports. So trade forces the domestic price to rise to the world price. Domestic producers are better off because they can now sell at a higher price. But who's now worse off? Domestic consumers are worse off because now they have to buy at a higher price. So let's just have a quick reminder of consumer and producer surplus, and we're going to look at that without trade initially, and then we'll compare the situation to when we export and when we import. So first of all, the consumer surplus, it's defined as the value that people are willing and able to buy a good, less the price that they actually have to pay. So they're paying the equilibrium price, so they were willing and able to pay a much higher price. So all of this is the consumer surplus, because nobody had to pay the price that they were willing and able to pay that was above the equilibrium. They all got to receive the equilibrium price. The producer surplus. We have producers who are willing and able to produce at this low price, but lo and behold, they get the equilibrium price. So this whole triangle is known as the producer surplus. Let me just write this in for your notes. Producer surplus. And up here we have the consumer surplus. Now let's look at what happens after trade if we're exporting. So let's just make sense of this before we go any further. We know that this is the domestic demand. And so this is going to be QD domestic. And at the world price, this is QS domestic, what we're producing domestically. We know that all of these are exports. So let's look first at the consumer surplus. Because the price has now increased from the equilibrium, because we have now allowed trade, that consumer surplus has shrunk by quite a bit. If we look at the producer surplus, because they're receiving a much higher price now, they're receiving PW rather than the equilibrium, the producer surplus is all of this area. So if we look at the combined surplus, so if we add the consumer surplus with the producer surplus, which is also known as the community surplus, it is larger than before, because in essence what's happened is that we've picked up this entire triangle here as a new extra surplus, which is larger than what we had before without trade. So the gains of sellers exceed the loss of buyers. In other words, the total surplus in such a country increases. So we can see that trade raises the economic well-being of the nation, since the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. And in other words, we could say that the community surplus is larger. Now also within a nation, we see that the consumer surplus is smaller, but the producer surplus is larger. In a nation, we have both consumers and we have producers, both part of the economy. So if the community surplus is larger, we're seeing that the overall economic well-being of the nation is higher as a result. So let's look if the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price. So now we're going to be an importer. Now, I want to emphasize one thing and make this clear. The IB several years ago had made a general sort of criticism that papers worldwide were not referring to the supply curve properly. So when we're dealing with the supply curve at the world price, we need to say supply of the rest of the world, or the world supply, and then to put equals world price. Make sure that you put both. And here's the price. So once again, we're going to see that it's perfectly elastic, because remember, each economy is relatively tiny compared to the rest of the world. And if we're importing, we can import as much as we want, as long as we're willing to pay PW, because we're tiny relative to all the other suppliers that are out there busy selling their goods that we could potentially import. So what happens if the world price is below the domestic price? So let's look again at, if we're dealing with this, we're going to look at where it's going to intersect. This is QS, the domestic supply, domestic quantity supplied. We're going to see that QD domestic has increased in response to the lower price. And if we have a larger quantity demanded than we have quantity supplied, we would say that this is a shortage, but because we're dealing with trade, that shortage is made up of imports. So the domestic price after trade is permitted must equal the world price. We can't, assuming that the goods are identical, we can't have two price structures. We can't have a higher domestic price that people say, well, hey, you know, we'll buy that because it's Canadian, unless they've done some incredible advertising campaign for an identical good, which is unlikely to be successful. What happens is if we are allowing imports to come in, and we can import as much as we want as long as we're willing to pay the the world price, then the domestic price must fall to the world price, or else no one would buy the domestic goods. They would only buy imports. So let's look at the producer and consumer surplus after trade. Well, we know that the price has fallen, so this now is the entire consumer surplus. Producers are not so happy, the domestic producers, because they now are operating at the world price, which is lower than the original equilibrium price, so the producer surplus has shrunk. But once again, if we add the consumer surplus with the producer surplus, looking at the community surplus, it is greater than without trade. And the triangle that we've picked up this time is this triangle. So we have an additional surplus, or overall surplus. So when trade forces the domestic price to fall, we know that consumers are better off and producers are worse off. Once again, the gains of the buyers exceed the losses of the sellers. Well, not once again, but the overall, community surplus is greater. And again, trade raises the economic well-being of the nation in the sense that the gains of the winners exceed the losses of the losers. Or in other words, we can say that the community surplus is greater. And a reminder that in an economy, you have both consumers and producers, and since the community surplus is greater, we say that economic well-being has improved. So how might a country benefit from trade? Well, we know that we can have more choice, sometimes lower prices. And why I say sometimes lower prices is, let's say if we had a situation of no trade and the domestic price is lower than the world price, once we open up the country to trade, the domestic price will increase to the world price, as we saw on several slides ago. So sometimes lower prices, especially if we're importing. Access to products we might not have. If you're exporting, so if exporting, you might now have more revenue, so more sales. You might be able to benefit from economy of scale. And I'm going to put etc. because there's many reasons why a country might benefit from trade, and we've looked at some of those in previous classes. So the overall benefits of trade. International trade tends to expand the overall economic pie of a nation, so think of that community surplus, but usually there are some participants with a smaller piece, so some people within trade might be worse off. Who might be the losers from trade? Well, how about an industry that can no longer compete? So you might have deindustrialization. You might have more unemployment. You might have, for instance, a situation like the States where they have been importing more than exporting. You can, well, we'll be looking at this more when we look at balance of payments, but there can be many problems when you import more than export in terms of becoming more indebted to other nations. So if consistently importing more than exporting, so could lead to indebtedness, to other countries, and we'll look at that more when we do balance of payments. And I'm going to put etc. because there can be many losers from trade. So what might a country do to protect those losers from trade? Well, we might look at things like tariffs, which are taxes on imports. Quotas, which is restricting imports. We might look at subsidies to domestic industries to bring down the domestic price so that those industries can be more competitive. We might look at currency manipulation. So, and often what countries will do is to try and depreciate their currency so their exports are cheaper for other countries to buy and imports are more expensive. And there could be a host of administrative barriers, red tape and barriers, even sort of environmental or safety or health standards that are imposed that can also limit trade. So we'll be heading off next lesson for the tariffs and quotas and looking at protectionism.